Lane asked if I'd be willing to talk at this event about the history of Radicchio in the United States, with kind of this question about like who was the first to grow Radicchio on this continent, which is the kind of question that I hate a little bit, because just because evidence doesn't exist or that I haven't found it doesn't mean that that evidence doesn't exist, or that I have the full story. You know, I'm a journalist. I'm not an academic, and I'm not a historian, and I'm not a farmer. So I'm going to share what I've learned with you all. I had some really important help putting this presentation together from Alice Formiga, who I think might be there today, who is a professor at Oregon State University, who really helped me kind of learn some things about the early 20th century portion of this presentation. So I have a bibliography for this. I'm happy to share it with you if you'd like. I've put my contact information in the last slide, so you can just email me if you're interested in that. So, okay, so this is a 1825 painting of Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's plantation and estate, by painter Jane Braddock Particulas, who's like a landscape painter. And I put this as the slide for colonial America because there's actually evidence that Radicchio has been grown in the United States since before the United States was actually a country, although it has always kind of been linked to the presence of Italians and what I've been able to find. So the earliest mention of Radicchio that I found was from Thomas Jefferson's garden journal. Thomas Jefferson was an avid gardener, and he was also quite a good record keeper. So he kept a really detailed journal what he grew in his vegetable garden. And let me go to the next slide, hang on. Here we go. So on the right-hand side here is a page from Thomas Jefferson's garden book from 1774. And he liked growing unusual things. And he had met this guy named Filippo Mazzei, an Italian guy from Toscana, from Tuscany, in London. My understanding is that he and Benjamin Franklin were in London. They met him, they kind of like became friends. And they kind of convinced him to come to North America to grow grapes. So Filippo Mazzei set sail from Italy in 1773, and he arrived in Virginia with about 10 wine growers and a bunch of plants. And he actually brought seeds that Thomas Jefferson planted in his garden. And so you can kind of see, I think I have the next page is a closer up. I'm gonna go over to the next page. Is a closer zoom in on this section. So this is 1774, it's dated March 15th. And these are the things that Thomas Jefferson planted. And you can see that the second one down is something called Radicchio di Pistoia, succory or wild endive. And I tried to find out what Radicchio di Pistoia was, and was not successful. You know, I wasn't able to find any paintings or references. We don't know what that was, but that it's listed and linked with this, you know, it was also called wild endive, suggests to me that it was something like what we think of today as Radicchio. So this, and you can also see, this is kind of interesting. I mean, there's a few Italian vegetables in this list, right? Aglio di Toscana, I think is what that says, Toscania, so garlic. There's capo cappuccio. My screen is kind of covering the rest of it, but so Thomas Jefferson was also sort of this known Italophile. So it's not a huge surprise that he was availing himself of these seeds from Filippo Mazzei. And then after that, I really was not able to find any particular references to Radicchio until the kind of late 19th and early 20th century. And this is when there's a huge wave of Italian immigration to the United States. So between 1880 and 1930, about 17 million people left Italy. And they went all over the world, but the United States was actually the most popular destination. Over 4 million Italians came to the United States between 1881 and 1920. This was a time after unification in Italy, so Italy became a the country that we think of today in 1861. And that process, there was economic turmoil, there was some cultural turmoil, and a lot of people left. Most of the immigrants who came to the United States came from southern Italy. So I put a little map down there. You can kind of see it's sort of like everything from Lazio down, but not exclusively. Some people did come from the north as well. And a lot of the people who came to the United States were peasants, they were agricultural people, and it's highly likely that many of them brought seeds from home and definitely new foodways to North America. So, oh yeah, so I'm gonna go to the next slide, which just is a photo. This is a photo from 1900. This is Mulberry Street in New York. This is kind of the heart of Little Italy. And so this is at that peak, kind of in the peak of Italian migration to the US. Lots of Italians settled in urban centers in the Northeast. So New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New England, Chicago. These were really kind of hot spots of Italian settlement in the United States at this time. I put this picture because there's in the bottom left-hand corner you can see it's kind of like a market scene. And I was like, oh man, if we zoom in, are we gonna see Radicchio? Please. I don't think we actually do. I think it's potatoes and onions and some other stuff, but we can imagine that perhaps Radicchio was there. And one thing that kind of helps us imagine that is on the next slide. So this is something that Alice Formia actually found in her research. She found several mentions from the first couple of decades of the 1900s of something called an orchid salad, orchid lettuce, being sold in New York and New Jersey. So she also found a mention in an Italian book that she has, and this is her citation that it's from 1936, and the title of the book is Imbiancamento e forzatura delle cicorie e del dente di leone, which means blanching and forcing of chicory and dandelion. The book was produced by the Sgaravati Seed Company in Padua, and it has a whole chapter about Cicoria variegata di Castelfranco, and it describes how some Italian growers in the United States made a fortune with it and called it insalata orchidea, which means orchid salad or orchid lettuce. And so, another mention of this that I thought was pretty interesting was this, there was a book written in 1963 about Delmonico's restaurant. So Delmonico's is a restaurant in New York City. It's quite famous. It was founded in 1831. It was founded by Italian-speaking Swiss, two Italian-speaking Swiss men, John and Peter Delmonico. And it has this really storied reputation. And so in this book, this author, Lately Thomas, described how the fanfare over Delmonico's orchid salad, which was composed of chicory grown in shades of red and green, which when opened resembled a flower. So that sounds a lot like Radicchio to me, potentially Castelfranco, something like Castelfranco. Again, it's hard to say for sure, but that reference is quite tantalizing. And then there's also this quote here from a book called City Homes on Country Lanes, Philosophy and Practice of the Home in a Garden, which was published in 1921, that mentions orchid lettuce. And as we know, right, like people confuse Radicchio with a lettuce all the time. There's no reason to believe that wasn't also happening in the 1920s. So in this kind of reference, I chuckled at this because they talk about this beautiful orchid lettuce with its purplish and reddish leaves. And Mrs. Frank, who's somebody described in the book, developed a purple potato to go with it so she could serve what she calls a violet luncheon. So I think even it's fun to think that even 100 years ago, people were really getting a charge out of some of the aesthetic qualities of Radicchio as well. Oh, hang on, I have to get to the next slide. There we go. Here are another couple of mentions of this orchid chicory or orchid lettuce, orchid salad. The one in the upper right, Alice found, and I think this one is super neat. It's from a publication called Florists Exchange, which was sort of an industry classifieds for the horticultural trade. And this was published in 1915. It was a listing placed by Warren Shin, forcing root specialist, listing all of the different forcing roots that he had available to grow. And you can see the second one down, he talks about asparagus, rhubarb, a couple of different kinds, Witloof chicory and French endive. And then he also says that he has excellent orchid chicory, which forces a beautiful pink, fine for the great hotels and restaurants. So this is definitely a tick in the orchid salad is Radicchio column. The listing there on the left is from Thorburns seed catalog in 1914, and it describes orchid lettuce. When they seem quite clear that it is a lettuce and that it is used in famous orchid salads. So that's kind of a tick for the lettuce column. Another one is this listing from William Woys Weaver, who's he wrote a book called Heirloom Vegetable Gardening in the 90s. And he describes a speckled lettuce that, this is an excerpt from a much longer entry. He said that it had been saved by Mennonites and that it was the same variety as Thorburns orchid. So I think there's some lack of clarity here, but what we can say is that in the 20s, the teens and 20s, there was this trendy orchid salad that was beautiful, speckled, and maybe contained radicchio, maybe contained lettuce, or both. Okay, and so then in the middle of the 1900s, things kind of quiet down for radicchio. There aren't many mentions of it in media or history books that I was able to find. It's hard to say exactly why. I think there's sort of a combination of possible factors. World War II kind of disrupts society, disrupts life, both in Italy and in the United States. There's some anti-Italian sentiment in the United States because we are at war with Italy. This is kind of the time of the rise of convenience foods, so canned foods, frozen foods. And it isn't until kind of the late 1970s and early 1980s that people start talking about radicchio again in the United States. So there are two kind of New York Times excerpts here on this slide. The one in the upper left is from 1977. It's from a Craig Claiborne story about, it's actually a travel story. It's about like going to Northern Italy. It recommends places to eat and places to stay and stuff like that. And he gives Radicchio this cursory little mention. He says, incidentally, if in Italy you have a chance to sample Radicchio, a red leaf lettuce, so he gets that wrong, order it forthwith. The crisp, bittersweet leaves are a delight. And then just a few years later, in 1980, Florence Fabricant writes this story about imported new specialty vegetables that are becoming available for the first time in the United States. And one of those that she mentions is radicchio. It's in the context, right? I mean, the title of the story is Exotic and Expensive Produce Arrives. So it's in the context of something that's new, something that's not, an everyday food. It's also kind of fun to look at the other vegetables that were exotic and expensive new vegetables at the time, including like jicama and Swiss chard and celeriac. So there starts to be interest in the 80s, and here we go. Oh, this is just another quick story. This is from 1988. This is a Barbara Kafka story that's kind of pushing back a little bit against radicchio being lettuce and only being useful for its color. So she actually has some quite nice sounding recipes here and fairly good information about radicchio. So part of why this is happening is because, oh gosh, I did. There we go. Um, because a few things, this is kind of some speculation for me, but a few things are conspiring to kind of bring Radicchio back to American consciousness. So people are starting to think about farm to table and fresh ingredients again after this kind of convenience food boom. Chez Panisse opens in 1971. That kind of California cuisine starts happening. Italian stuff becomes really fashionable in the United States. Americans are traveling, they go to Italy, they're having a nice time. Italian Americans have achieved widespread acceptance in the United States, and it becomes kind of an aspirational cultural thing. Low-fat diets also become quite trendy at this time. That kind of began in the 60s, but the 80s were really kind of a peak for that. So salads, right? Everyone's eating salads. And then that's also kind of bolstered by the technology being developed for packaged cut greens, like bagged salads. So this is kind of a transformative event for the lettuce industry. It began around 1990. And, the kind of key drivers were like an expansion of the cold chain, the creation of micro-perforated bags and other kinds of packaging that increase shelf life for cut lettuce, including like the self-contained salads with like dressing and toppings and forks and stuff in there. So those really start to take off. You can see this chart on the bottom right-hand side. This is from this guy who is a consultant, Johnny Bowman, to the packaged vegetable industry, but he kind of wrote the story about the history of the packaged salad. And this chart kind of compares US consumption of head lettuce on the top versus loose leaf and baby greens between the years of 1987 and 2017. And you can see that they basically converge, right? There's just this huge uptick in loose leaf, baby green mix sales. So all of those things kind of conspire to make Radicchio in demand. Next slide. Sorry, there we go.
Margaret, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. This is just a quick mention. This is a report on some Radicchio trials that they did in Connecticut in 1987 and 1988. And they mentioned that in that report that domestic production has now begun in California and Florida. So by the late 1980s, domestic production is happening in the United States. And I talked with two kind of quite prominent Radicchio growers in the United States. So the next couple of sections are based on interview material from them. And they were kind of two of the first sort of early movers at scale. So the first one is J. Marchini Farms, and they're based in La Grande, California, but they have kind of multiple, which is in California's Central Valley. They have a few different sites in California. They also grow in Salinas. This is a picture of Florindo Marchini. Florindo came to the United States from Lucca in the 1920s. He moved to San Francisco and he met another Italian, Carlo Giampaoli. They both loved to grow plants. They started a company together growing tomatoes. But he was also, an avid home gardener, and his son, Joe Marchini, actually remembers growing Radicchio in his dad's home garden as a child. He described it as a small green Radicchio that they grew. And so when Joe took over the farm, he decided that he wanted to go to Italy to try to source Radicchio seeds. So on the left is Joe Marchini, and on the right, also holding that Radicchio, is Joe Marchini with his son, Jeff. The photo on the left is from 1980. The photo on the right is from 1990. Joe went to Italy to try to source Radicchio seed. He'd grown up speaking Italian at home. He was a native Italian speaker. And he said it took him 3 visits to develop the relationships that he needed to get answers about how to actually grow Radicchio effectively. He said that people were generally kind of guarded when talking with him, but he was able to establish a relationship eventually with some Italian growers who helped him access seed and also understand the importance of timing, when to plant, when to harvest, the sort of technical aspects of Radicchio production. So he introduced a brand called Joe's Premium in the late 1980s that specialized in Italian specialty crops. So they grow the Chioggia style Palarosa, the round red Radicchio, as well as Treviso and Castelfranco. And then some other, like they grow figs, they grow puntarella, they grow fennel, cardoons, agretti. And I asked Joe, like, what was it like in the beginning? You know, were people into it? Like, who was buying it? And he said they grew about 20 acres of Radicchio the first year in 1989, and they sold most of it directly to restaurants or to markets in San Francisco, and that it was a hand sell. I mean, he would literally load up the truck with boxes of Radicchio and go from account to account being like, I know you only ordered 2, but I'm going to give you 4. Just try to, you know, get people excited about it. So they also said when the processed salad business was growing, that was like a big boom for them. They started supplying Fresh Express and Dole, who were buying Radicchio exclusively for the color, basically. And they also began exporting to Japan in the 1990s, Japan and Korea, and those, they said, are really important markets for them as well. Today, it's still a family-owned farm. They grow between 1,200 and 1,300 acres of Radicchio every year. They have sites in the Central Valley, in Salinas, and in Mexico, because they are shipping Radicchio like 52 weeks a year. I asked them if they'd ever tried growing Tardivo and doing the forcing. They said yes, they tried, and they felt that it was fairly successful, but it was too expensive, and there just wasn't enough demand for what it had to cost. Let me get the next slide. I don't know why I'm having, there we go. And then there was,
Margaret.
Okay, this is another producer. This is Lucio Gomiero, who is from Italy. He's from Padua, and he was working in an unrelated field. He met another guy who had experience growing Radicchio in northern Italy, and he said, hey, there's all this demand for Radicchio in the United States from these packaged salad sales, companies, distributors. Why don't we move to the United States and try growing it there? So they did. They first moved to Georgia. They tried growing it in Georgia. They found that the weather was like not quite right. It was this narrower harvest window. It was often either too hot or too cold. So they moved to Salinas. They at first they grew just 1 acre as kind of a trial. And that was a success. So they expanded beyond that in successive years. Sort of interesting about them, they commuted back and forth from Italy to California. They also had a farm in Italy where they were growing seeds for their California production. So they were growing all of their own seeds in Italy, and those seeds were exclusive for use at their company called European Vegetable Specialties. And he kind of echoed what the Marchini said, which is that, in the beginning, everybody thought it was a red cabbage. The Chioggia style was what was grown most often, simply because it's heavier, and so the yield is better. So there was a lot of hand selling, a lot of talking, a lot of teaching, but that the packaged salad was really kind of the key driver. At the largest, they were growing 3,200 acres of Radicchio, which sort of blew my mind, in Salinas, in Arizona, in Florida, and in Orange County. And they said that after, there was this really rapid growth, but then after 2008 and the financial crisis, that the mood sort of changed for the market, and that some of the bigger processors began to substitute red cabbage into those salad mixes, which kind of was it brought sales down at that time. So Lucio sold the business a few years ago. He's retired. He's actually making wine near Padua now. So he's doing something else. I'm going to skip this because I know we're short on time. It's a really goofy ad from a British salad company, but oh gosh, is it going to play? No, okay. And just really briefly, this is, I talked, so when I told my mom about this project, she was like, oh, it's funny. I trialed Radicchio for Renee Shepard. Renee's was called Shepherd Seeds back then, at my at the community garden that I started in Haines, Alaska in 1985, because Shepherd Seeds, now it's called Renee's Garden Seeds, was beginning to introduce Radicchio seeds for sale to home gardeners. So I talked briefly with Renee as well, and she said that that Radicchio never really caught on in her experience with home gardeners. It was tricky for growing in the United States, according to kind of the Italian timing, because in much of the country, it's very cold here in the winter, or it's hot, it's tropical, it's deserty, and it never gets cold. And that, bitterness had been kind of a tough sell in the 80s and 90s. And that another issue was that it's not pretty in the garden, right? As many of you know, it grows kind of, the leaves get slimy on the outside and people think it's dead. And so she feels that Radicchio needs kind of like either a signature dish or a study coming out that says Radicchio is super healthy and good for you to eat, for Radicchio to kind of get widespread acceptance in the home garden. And then flying through this is the last one. This is a story by Margarett Roach that came out last year in the New York Times. Many of the people interviewed in the story are actually at the symposium right now. And this, I felt like, was a really cool note to end on, because this gives readers just really excellent information about understanding and growing Radicchio. And that understanding is going to be key to kind of its growth in the United States in the future. So here's my contact information. If anybody would like to email me for more information or for the bibliography, please do.